Domestic violence agencies are, a human service organization, and they are also under really severe stress and often in crisis. Funding has decreased. Paperwork often takes a lot of time and energy. Not everyone in a community is necessarily supportive of the organization. So there's a lot going on, both internally and externally, for domestic violence agencies. One of the ways that shows up is in the annual turnover rate, which for domestic violence advocates is 40%. That's a national figure, and in some places it'll be higher, in some places lower, but in general, on average, that means that almost half of the people doing domestic violence work across the country are new every year. And so you can imagine that it's hard to create a strong organization with a solid knowledge base when almost half of the people are new. So my goal for today, which is more hopeful than what I just said in that last section, is to provide you with kind of a perspective or a different frame for what is happening or may be happening in your organization, why it's going on, and what you can do about it. And my goal is, of course, to help you as a board member to respond to what's happening in your organization in a way that helps your organization to meet its goals. This presentation is geared for board members. So if you're not a board member, that's fine. We are welcoming to you and glad to have you, but it is specifically for board members. So if you have questions or information, or you'd like to know more about this from a different perspective, say staff of a domestic violence agency, we're happy to do that. Okay, a few points. This presentation is short. That may be merciful, I don't know. And we're not going to fix anything today because we only have 45 minutes or an hour or so, but we will take the first step. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, which is probably many of you, I was the director of a domestic violence agency for 20 years. And for at least 15 of those years, I did not know any of the things that I'm going to tell you about today in the next 45 minutes or so. So it took me 15 years of trial and error, and mostly error, to understand this. So this material is also really, it's abstract. And so even I now, who have been studying it for 5 years, I've been immersed in it and thinking about it. It's even somewhat still new to me. So if you think that you don't entirely understand it or you don't get it, please do not feel bad. As I said, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I'm just now starting to really understand it. The next point I want to make is this is not about identifying and shedding problem people. You will have problem people in any organization you do, and you have to do something about that. But this is not about just sort of getting rid of those people. I mean, that can't be your only strategy, because if it is, what happens is new problem people come to fill the role of the problem people who left. So as I said, there are people who are problematic, and they may not work in your organization, but it's important to also think about the whole system and to be able to get to the root of the problem. I also want to just mention that as a board, you might think you don't have a very important role to play, and that you go to meetings and maybe have lunch or breakfast and vote on a few things or whatever. But in fact, as you'll see, you have what you do, even if you don't know it, is very important, and you are a model, even though you may not know it, for the rest of your organization. So we're going to be talking then today about culture, I guess. And so I want to say a few things about that. The first thing is organizations are not people, but they are like people in that they have strengths and weaknesses and characteristics and ways that they respond to what happens in the environment, ways that they do things. In people, we would call that a personality, but in an organization, we'd call it a culture. And what that culture is made up of a bunch of people. In our case, it's clients working with clients, who are working with staff, who work with each other, who work with directors and the board and the community. All of us working together and interacting, right, to get the work done. So that's really what a culture is. The two main themes, the anchoring themes and the points of this webinar are as follows. The first is the theory or the concept that organizations come to resemble the causes that they seek to address. So understanding what that means, what it looks like kind of concretely, and how it affects us is a primary purpose. So organizations come to look like the cause that they address. The second point is that exposure to trauma is a significant factor in the development of your culture. Arguably, every single one of the clients in your domestic violence agency has been exposed to trauma. If they weren't exposed to trauma, they wouldn't be there. I know that sometimes people say, well, that person's not really a domestic violence victim, you know, she or he or whatever, is really just homeless. But as you probably know, 90% or maybe more of homeless women and children have a history of domestic violence somewhere in their past, and being homeless is in itself traumatizing. So all of your clients are coming to you having experienced trauma. In addition, many of your staff people have also experienced trauma. They may have experienced it growing up as a child or maybe as an adult. I'm not going to say a lot about this, but some of you may be aware of it. There's a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences or Events Study, and in it they found that they looked at, I think, something like 18,000 people. This was in California. 63% of the people that they studied had been exposed to physical, emotional, sexual abuse or neglect. 63% in just the regular population. The people who come to work in our organization often come there because they have something that they want to contribute or give back, because they've experienced trauma in their own lives, they have a passion for it, and they really want to devote their lives to making it better for others who are undergoing similar trauma. But the point is, in one study, in fact, this was at a mental health agency, over 80% of the staff had experienced significant trauma growing up. So everyone in your organization, your clients, and probably many of your staff are coming from that place where they've experienced trauma. And in addition, your staff are hearing the stories that your clients tell about trauma. And it was called, you know, secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And those hearing the stories of people who've been exposed to trauma causes the same changes in the brain as if you had been directly exposed, right? So the point is that there's a lot of trauma going on in our organizations, and it affects how we operate and what you as a board need to know about that. So here's the presentation outline. Can you believe it? We haven't even started the presentation yet. How do we come to resemble the causes that we address? What does it mean? What does it look like concretely, and how does it affect our organizations? How are our organizations affected by exposure to trauma? How does that show up? And my goal is to be able to give you a different frame than maybe than you're used to. If you're like me, or like I was for 15 years, you don't know this yet. So it's to give you something to think about. So I have here a slide that says optional introductions, but I didn't know that all our names would be on there. But if you do have any questions or anything that you hope I will cover, now might be the time to sort of send that over to Alicia, and she can let me know. One point I really want to make is that the way in which you define the problem is the way in which the problem gets solved, right? That's sort of obvious. So when we're asking ourselves about our organizations and what's going on, the question is, as I see it, I guess, and as other people who study trauma see it, is not what's wrong with this organization, that all these things are happening. It's more, what is what's happened to your organization that this is the way that people are, that this is the state of the organization. So it's not what's wrong, it's what's happening. When you come from that place of what's happening, it gives you a different way, I think, to look at the problem and to move forward. So when we look like our cause, what do we look like? And if I were going to do this for staff people, which I have, including in Esperanza, actually, in Santa Fe, just for example, it's helpful to think about what are the ideas and the words that we use every day, right? And in the case of a domestic violence agency, those words or concepts or themes involve crisis and survival, like literally, danger, victims, abusers, accountability, punishment, injustice, empowerment, and advocate. This is kind of the language that we use every day. And we're often against something. We're often against a lot of things, right? We're against the bad treatment that our clients have received from their partners. We're against the way the system doesn't always work very well. Even our name, right? We are the Coalition Against Domestic Violence, right? So that says something about our posture, I guess. Let me give you a couple of examples outside of domestic violence about how an organization can come to look like its cause. And these are true. There was a strategic planning firm, and they specialized in helping organizations that were having a hard time finding a direction and getting focused, right, as you might expect, right? Strategic planning, that wound up completely without focus, didn't know where they were going or in what direction, right? They began to look like their cause, which was not having a focus. An environmental group who was very concerned about energy use had a private plane. They would fly, you know, a person or two people around. Organizations that work with abuse, right, often begin to become embroiled in an abuse dynamic, and we're going to say more about that in a second. But one of the key words in domestic violence, as anyone knows who's in this, is power and control, right? It has special meaning in domestic violence. So let's say, you know, that you say to the CEO of, you know, General Electric or some big company, right? You know, Mr. CEO, I think you have kind of an issue with power and control. You seem to like it, right? That person would look at you like you had three heads, right? Oh, duh, of course, right? Everybody wants power and control, right? And in most of the sort of regular non-DV world, people seek it. They want it and they don't apologize for it necessarily. But in domestic violence organizations, because that's the center, right, of what abusers do. They use power and control against other people, which makes it kind of illegitimate. Well, actually, it's worse than that. If you really want to insult someone, say a director in a domestic violence organization, you accuse them of being interested in power and control. That's like mortifying, right? That's one of the worst things that you can say. And how is this important for you as a board? Because you as a board are probably thinking to yourself about your director, get that staff in line, right? Make sure that they do their paperwork and we get our reports in, right? I mean, sort of manage this place. That's how the rest of the world works. But in a domestic violence organization, it's much harder for the director. Directors often wind up in these really bad or untenable positions where they're asked to control things and exert their power in an organization that sees that as fundamentally abusive. So it's a really hard line to walk. And I think as a board, that's something that you need to know. So I want to give you an example of something, but before I do that, I want to give you another big word that I didn't understand for many years either. It's called a parallel process. So a lot of you by now probably do know what that is, but basically it means that something that happens in one place gets expressed in another place. And you can use that as a clue to understanding what's going on in your organization. So let me just tell you a little story here, a little example. Many years ago, when I was the director of a shelter in another state, I was asked by a funder to go and visit another program. And this program had been having all kinds of problems. And they asked me to meet with the director, and the funder was going to meet with the board. So one of the things that had happened is that an article had appeared in a very major newspaper. It was actually a column. And in a column, what was described was the executive director of this organization had demanded to see the appointment book of a staff person. The staff person refused on the grounds that it was private information and it contained a record of her menstrual cycle. So apparently the director, according to witnesses and according to what was written in this article, chased the person around the room trying to get the appointment book. I mean, it's not funny, but and a power struggle, like a literal power struggle ensued where the director was trying to wrench it away from the employee. And so somebody who was watching this, I guess it was another staff person, told the press about this, right? So I was supposed to go in and try to figure out what was wrong with the director that she was chasing a staff person around the room trying to get her appointment book. I had no idea, absolutely no idea, right? So I was really of no help at all. Only later did I, as I sort of the rest of the story unfolded, and as I got more information, did I understand what was really happening. So in this organization, they had not had a very good relationship with the police. And the board was very concerned about that because I guess it wasn't just the police, but maybe other organizations too, that they didn't have good relationships with. So the board was worried about it. And under pressure from the, I don't know if it was the police chief or I can't remember, but some high-ranking law enforcement official, they decided to allow the police to come into the shelter to look for clients. So for example, if someone had a arrest warrant for, stealing a pair of socks at Walmart or something, right, the police could go in. Actually, I think what it was they made clients sign a release saying, it's okay if the police come in at will and look around, right? You can imagine, right? The board didn't do this because they're bad people. They did it because they were trying to stop what they saw as kind of the downward slide of their organization out in the community. So the response of the director and the staff, as you can imagine, was not, they were not pleased about this. It was against the law, but never mind that. It felt to them like a total violation of their privacy and their confidentiality and the client's confidentiality, right? And it was, but no one ever talked about that, right? They didn't have a discussion about it. It was just sort of hanging out there, and the staff and the director felt really, I think, as I said, violated and vulnerable. When you think about what happened then, right, so the staff and the director feel violated. Someone who has power is trying to get some personal information from them that they don't really have a right to. And in typical parallel process form, instead of that being discussed, what happened was the director then tried to get really private personal information from her staff, right? That's a parallel process. And the reason I'm telling you about that, I'm sure you're wondering, why am I telling you about that, is because it really gives you a clue. It helps you to ask the question again, not what's wrong with this organization, but what's happening to it, right? And what was happening is there was kind of a power struggle between, in this case, some members of the community and the organization. And if they had been able to sort of think about that a little bit and figure it out, if I had known even one little tenth of that, they might have been able to do something more effective, because I think the organization had some serious problems and they went on for kind of a long time. So let's talk for a minute about trauma. As I said, virtually, I would say all of your clients and most of your staff are exposed to trauma. And the exposure to trauma, right, does not only cause problems for your organization and for your people, but it has long-term effects. So its presence is contagious. And when everybody in your organization is responding as if they have been traumatized, which they have been, we call that being trauma organized. And when an organization is trauma organized, right, that's when you see turnover and low productivity and anxiety. One way that that is described in terms of culture is fight or flight, right? We all know that's a common response to trauma, right? If a wild animal is chasing you, you might freeze, right, or be ready to fight, or you might run, right? There are adrenaline and other chemicals that naturally occur when you're confronted with some sort of trauma. And in the short term, that's a really good idea because then you don't stand there, right, and allow yourself to be eaten by a wild animal. You take some sort of action. So it's adaptive. But it becomes harmful when that's the way things are done and that's the condition that people experience almost all the time. You know, an example, right, like say you drop your keys, right, and if you're kind of calm and relaxed, you will bend over and pick them up. But if you're thinking, oh my God, you know, something bad is happening and I have to get somewhere really quickly, you drop your keys, you pick them up, and you've lost your dexterity, right, and you drop them again. You can't think straight or clearly. You can't make decisions. You're really debilitated, right? And so in our organizations, trauma and fight or flight is the way things happen. So according to group theory, this is probably more than you want to know, but I've been reading about it, so I have to say it. Fight or flight, dependency pairing, this is the last thing I'll say about sort of in academic terms, are some group assumptions, and they're largely unconscious, that groups use as they try to interact with each other. And so I believe that our culture could rightly be considered fight or flight, and I believe that the exposure to trauma is the underlying cause of that, and all of that has consequences for your organization. So what are those? What are some of the signs of or responses to? The first is when you're operating in a fight-flight culture, people begin to see the world as a dangerous place, right? And so people begin to think in terms of friends and enemies, and that happens both inside your organization and outside. So inside it might be that the people who run the shelter don't get along with the people who run the counseling or who work in the children's program or who do the sexual assault or whatever. It's kind of an us-them mentality, internally and also externally. In one organization, there was I think this person was a shelter manager, I can't remember, became upset at the director of the organization and also some of the other people, and convinced all the people who worked in the shelter to begin wearing these big black armbands to work, right, as a show of unity and opposition to the director, right? That's kind of an example of an us and them. And people then tend to pair up and they gang up, and usually the people that get ganged up on, oddly, will be supervisors and authority figures, right? They tend to be the people who get the most in terms of blame. And, you know, I get lots of letters all the time, and emails and phone calls from shelters and programs all over, and it's often to tell me somehow that the manager or the supervisor or the director or somebody in that organization is usually misusing power and control or misusing their authority, and they want to let someone know. Sometimes it's clients who, in parallel process form, want to tell me how badly they are being treated by the shelter staff. So that's one, that's sort of us, them, the world is dangerous, you know, it's an, you know, us against others kind of mentality. The second thing that happens is that people lose the ability to manage their emotions. And so one of the things that I hear a lot is that people are yelling, right? I hear people are yelling. I get lots of communication from people about being yelled at. Staff are yelling at clients. Managers are yelling at staff. Directors are yelling at the managers. The board is yelling at the director, and so on. There's a lot of yelling. And I'm not entirely sure whether there really is yelling or whether that's the perception or it's some combination. But that certainly happens, right? The other, and so you might hear that, right? People are yelling all the time. That you might get a letter or something from someone saying that. The other response to trauma is to over-control, right? When everything feels out of control, which it naturally will in an organization that's dealing with life and death and trauma, the natural tendency is to try to get a handle on the thing, right? To try to contain it or control it. And so what happens in shelters is that a new rule is created every 5 minutes, right, to sort of make sure that the clients are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So we might say, you know what, Sue was eating peanut butter, on Friday in the group room after the carpet was cleaned. So therefore, we're going to stop that. So let's bring out our rule book and no eating peanut butter on Fridays, right? Until you wind up with a rule book the size of Texas, right? I lived in Michigan for some years, and so I knew people from the Kellogg Foundation way, way back. And one of them said to me, she said, Pam, when we go in to evaluate an organization, we look at the size of the policy manual. And in this case, right, bigger was not better, right? So if you have to develop a rule for everything or a policy to cover every eventuality, that means that you're not talking about things and you're not dealing with issues. So that's what I've seen, right? Lots and lots of rules to and when we suggest maybe there could be fewer rules, what happens is staff who work with clients are very scared about that. There's a lot of anxiety associated with that. Well, if we don't have any rules, we won't be able to control this thing, right? Not understanding, of course, as I didn't either, that when you begin to let go of some of that, right, things get better, right? So creating policies and rules instead of having healthy conversations about what's going on, right? The other thing is that everything becomes a crisis, and I mean everything, right? If you need ketchup from the basement, right, you need it right now. It's a crisis, right? It's no more or less a crisis than if someone's trying to break into the shelter, right? Because that atmosphere is there all the time. And that means that the staff are constantly feeling like there's a crisis. The director probably feels like that. And so if you as board members then are adding to that, right, then you have an organization that cannot be productive because everything is a crisis. Another sign and response is kind of to retreat basically into bureaucracy. This is part of the policy and making more rules, right? Instead of dealing with each other, we're just going to have a lot of bureaucracy. And when that happens, people get depressed and apathetic. Another sign of fight-flight culture has to do with people stop taking responsibility for their jobs and for what they do. They tend to blame others, and they can do it in ways that are really vindictive, right? So they're constantly complaining about their coworkers not doing enough or whatever it is, right? That becomes common. Boundary issues. I'm going to say something about this because this is really important for boards. When an organization is sort of trauma organized, people don't understand and don't respect boundaries. So they might sort of go around each other. Boards might be talking to staff or whatever. And all of that is very damaging to an organization. You've probably heard some of this already from the Center for Not-for-Profit Excellence, who's talking about boards. But it's important that you as a board respect the lines of authority and communicate in a direct way and not sort of backdooring, right? That nothing, I think, can harm or worse an organization faster than that. You also might find secrecy, right? I remember in my organization, we didn't have a lot of secrets except for maybe what people, what their salaries were and things like that. But I hired somebody who was very secretive and began holding meetings and closing doors. And people were taken aback by that. It's like, what's going on? What are they talking about, right? And all that created a lot of anxiety, right? So secrecy and a lack of transparency are part of the culture, but harmful. I think, as I probably mentioned, absenteeism and illness, turnover, isolation, programs withdraw from the community, or, and the other possibility is that they become very preoccupied with safety. I get lots of these kinds of calls and letters too. People will say, the director doesn't care about our safety. We don't have enough locks on the doors, or we don't have barbed wire, whatever it is. And the fact is, right, that you could never really, you can't make something into a fortress, although programs try, right? And I know that there are programs who have maybe barbed wire and, really serious security. And it's understandable. Of course, the problem with that is that it creates more sense of crisis and fear and anxiety. People are hyper aroused by it, right? And it can make things worse. Okay. So I want to spend just a minute. We don't have too much time, but I think as a board member, it would be helpful if you could ask your executive director and my guess is most of your directors have already talked to you about this, or know because they've done it themselves, but what is it like to be a staff person in your organization? I started off as I guess they called it a caseworker or something. And basically, I was working in the shelter, and I could not do it, really. I did it for, a few months, but it was by far and away the hardest job I ever had. So I think it's important for you as a board to know what your staff are going through so that you know when you're asking things of your director or your staff what they have going on. The first thing is it's completely unpredictable. You can't give them a big project, right? Let's finish this fundraiser by next Wednesday, because they could have, the police could be bringing somebody in, or the hospital could be calling. Their clients are having a variety of crises. They cannot plan their work. They don't really have a sense of control over it. And that's a problem, right? Because when you can't control your work or your environment, that contributes to ill health and depression and lots of other problems. But they can't plan their work. Every single day, their activities, what they do or they don't do, might involve life or death. And that's true of course, law enforcement too. But one of the differences is that people who work in shelters usually don't have very much power, right? Furthermore, the people that in your shelters are exposed on a daily basis to unresponsive systems, no offense to any systems who are on the phone, and constant exposure to injustice, right? Our systems really don't work like, and I'm not talking about in New Mexico, I'm talking about probably around the world, right? Our systems don't protect people. And there's a sort of helplessness that goes along with that, right? So ironically, your staffs are trying to empower clients while they themselves really feel a sense of helplessness. Learned helplessness, really, where you can't control the outcome of what happens. And they have to face that every day. And I know there's some people, I don't see her on the line, but a friend of mine, right, who finally said she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't do this work anymore because some really bad things had happened to a client of hers, and the person who did it I really got away with it, and I think she felt that she just couldn't do it anymore. The people that your staff see, the clients that your staff see, have multiple problems, chronic, long-term problems. And most psychologists and professionals will not work with that group. Or if they do, they'll work with just a few of them because it's too hard, right? They have too many problems. They're angry. It's just really, really difficult work. And so they don't want to spend 50 minutes, right, in an office with these people, but your staff live with these people, right? They're there all the time. And many of them, because they're under-resourced, don't have the skills or the training that they really need, right? And again, that's not your director's fault. It's because there's just not the money that really is required to be able to do that well. So they lack training and resources. And so the next slide really is just something for you to think about, right? So how, to think about how this is all showing up in your organization. And if you were an advocate or if you were even a director, what do you think it'd be like to work in that kind of environment, right? And what would you want, right? So to put yourself in their shoes, what would you want from a board if you were working in that sort of environment? So, okay, so I've laid out a whole bunch of problems here. Now the question is, what can be done about it? It probably seems like a very sort of dense, strange, complex problem, and it is, but there are things that you can do, and they're not really very hard things, right? It won't happen overnight, but there are things that you can do. And as a board member, remember that you have a role, right? And it's an important one because you're a model. So if you think about the appointment book example again, that what was happening in one area, right? The police were trying to get access to the shelter, got expressed in another area, right? And so the board, in this case, had they understood what they were agreeing to, right, might have viewed the whole thing differently. And they would have viewed the, the tug of war over the appointment book differently, probably. So what can you as a board member do? The first thing is you have to support your executive director. That's a must. Because if there are conflicts or unresolved conflicts or antagonisms between your director and some of your board members, that is going to trickle down and that is going to affect your organization, even though you might think that it doesn't, right? Parallel process, people know things. That is really important. So, I mean, if you can't support your director, that's another issue, right? But it's important that for the health of your organization that you be able to do that. Second really important part of this is to respect, again, your boundaries, right? And if you don't know what they are, and lots of people don't, the center can help you sort of figure out what those are. But not, going behind people's backs and backdooring and not talking to the staff and not doing your director's job or involving yourself in operations. All of these things might seem like they're small issues, but they can have a really big and harmful impact. Clarifying or helping your director to clarify roles, right? To the extent that you can help reduce uncertainty, which is really impossible in a domestic violence agency, but that will help so that people are clearer about what is expected of them so that they can then do it. And lessening control, right? Instead of creating more policies, right, getting a bigger rule book, because bigger isn't better, look for ways to increase input and sharing and conversation. Now, if I was talking to executive directors, there would be a much, much longer list. But because I'm talking to you as a board, right, it's abbreviated some. Ensuring adequate pay. I know that's really hard because the money isn't there. But, when you pay, when people are getting minimum wage, they hardly make more than the clients that they're serving, and they have the most stressful jobs in the world. I mean, I think Mike Rowe, isn't that the guy's name, who talks about the most dangerous jobs, like, shrimp fishing or something, right? I mean, these jobs are dangerous, too, to people's well-being. And so investing however you can. If you can't pay them more, maybe more vacation, more supervision, getting them help. If you can find an employee assistance program. Again, I know that some of this is just pie in the sky, and you could rightfully say, yeah, all that would be nice, but we barely have enough money to pay the electric bill. And I believe me, I totally get it. So this is the ideal. And not to let training be the first item on the chopping block when you don't have money. Just as I say this, I'm planning to put some training on the chopping block this year, right? So I'm not even doing what I'm suggesting here. But if possible, find other ways to do that because your staff need training and support. And then trying to, again, reduce the number of rules you have and policies in favor of sort of norms, like this is how we do things around here. There's a movement, this sort of, by the way, nationally, and it's also happening here in New Mexico, to eliminate rules in shelters. And believe me, that scares the heck out of people because they think if we have no rules, we won't be able to control what happens. That's an understandable response, but the places that are doing it right are reducing their rules and trying to find ways to talk about things are finding that it's much better for their organizations. Being bully-free, I guess that's probably obvious, but again, people who have been abused often become abusive themselves. And so, ironically, right, in our organizations, people who are bullying and abusive is a problem. And you can't, that's something that, you can't have that in your organization. You need to have an organization where people feel safe. And bullying just can't be something that you tolerate. Now, you could help those people to change, right? You could say to them, if you want to stay in our community and do this work, okay, we'll help you, but you can't do this anymore, right? So, there's enough sort of on the outside, right, of bullying and abuse, but to have it in your organization, it's a risk to have, but to have it in your organization is something that you need to be really wary of. Okay, and then I would like, if you would just remember that, again, how you define the problem is the way in which you will define the solution. And so the question isn't, what is wrong with this organization anyway? Asking from the perspective of a board member, what's wrong with these people? It's what's happening to it that these things are occurring. There is help available. We can provide help to you at perhaps very little or no cost. If we can't, we can figure out somebody who can. And so I would hope that you would call us. We can do presentations, for staff people, again, for boards. We can do longer presentations, or we can do shorter presentations, although not much shorter. So you really just need to call us, and we can figure out how to do something for you. So finally, being exposed to trauma in a domestic violence organization is totally is inevitable, right? You can't get away from it. But the long-term negative effects on your people and on your organization and on your clients does not need to be inevitable. And so when you as a board member, and you matter, by the way, to your organization, you do matter, when you understand some of this, then you will be less likely to react. So when something appears in the newspaper with someone tugging on an appointment book, right? Your director is trying to get the appointment book from her staff person, you will, instead of saying, which will be understandable, wow, that place is, those people are crazy, right? You can understand where that comes from and help your director and the rest of your organization to implement policies that will help.
Carol has a question. She's asking if we do training on the consensus model.
We don't, and there may be people who do, although, I think that there are pros and cons to that, and I think when you're dealing with an organization that is traumatized, like domestic violence organizations are, that there are some risks to doing that. There may be some positive benefits too, but it's also very complicated, and so that's so we can, if you want training on the consensus model, we don't do it, but I think we can find someone who would.
Okay.
Oh, members who just sit there. Oh. Members who just sit there and nod their heads to everything. Yes. That is a problem that I do hear about a lot. And that's, part of the problem, right, is that people don't talk about anything. They disengage, or maybe they talk at other, behind the scenes or whatever. And so it's really hard to, to engage people. But I think that we'd be happy to help you with that. We either have or can get people who are communication people to help you. So if you would just send me an email, I would be really happy to talk to you more about that. But the other just piece to throw out is that, boards have they're a governing body, and they have a responsibility. You have a fiduciary responsibility and other kinds of responsibilities. And so, have you ever heard the commercial, right, where they're talking about a puppy or something that's running for office, right? And, someone says, well, if you aren't voting, then who are you electing, right? And so the point is that you are responsible, board members are responsible for their organizations. And so it behooves them to be engaged and to know what's going on, because they're responsible. And sometimes people just need to be reminded of that. And people are scared, too. I understand that, too, sometimes to say anything.
Let's see. Mario says, we discovered in that our past ED was abusive with our staff and created an environment of fear. Our current ED has done a terrific job in repairing this. As board of a DV organization, how should we interact with our staff to help heal what was really a lack of board oversight in the past?
Wow, that's fantastic that you know that and that you want to do something. First, as I said, creating an environment where there's a lot of anxiety, right, in DV organizations, and for all kinds of reasons. And so it's important that you have a director who can kind of, hold that, right, who understands that and can deal with that. But in order for that person to be able to do that, that person needs support from you as the board. They need to hear directly from you, and you need to hear directly from her or him, and to respect boundaries, right, to make sure that staff have what they need to support your director in implementing maybe some programs or practices to increase the amount of effective communication that people have. There are lots of models out there. Not lots. That's no. There are a few models out there to help organizations like DV organizations deal more effectively with the trauma. And I can also let you know what some of those are. You could, for example, go to the website, which I think is called sanctuaryweb.com or org. I'm sorry, I'm not sure. There are a whole bunch of materials and curriculum, so there's a lot that can be done. But I think remembering that you're a model, communicating directly and being honest, supporting your executive director, and making sure that your staff have what they need, training, time off, supervision, whatever it is a good start. And just asking the question is to me, that's a major move in the right direction. Asking the question, what can we do for our staff, is fantastic. So again, please feel free to email me, and I would love to talk to you in more detail and give you, as much information as I have about this.
And we have one more question from Debbie. She's asking, how can board personnel committee know how to be responsible in looking at possible issues when a former staff complains that the treatment her supervisor showed toward her was just like domestic violence?
Yes, this is very, very common. These are the kinds of things that boards hear all the time, that they struggle with. These are the kinds of things that I get letters about. And so, the Center for Not-for-Profit Excellence will probably have something to say about that. But it's a delicate balance because you don't want to involve yourself in, you know, the sort of operations and the personalities of your organization, right? That's a boundary thing, and that can lead to big issues. However, staff need to have some mechanism, I think, to report to a personnel committee that there's that kind of behavior going on. And I think it's often, I'll probably say the wrong thing here, it's considered that it should usually be done in writing, right? So that a staff person should be able to write to the personnel committee, not to the whole board, right, but to the personnel committee or the personnel chair, say these are the kinds of things that are going on. And then I think the personnel committee can then speak with the director and try to kind of find out about that. And sometimes bringing in someone helps, right? But the other issue is not, as a board member, not to automatically go to that place. Like, that director is abusive. They may be, right? They may well be, but it might also be that the people who are working in your organization, because of their exposure to trauma, either personally or professionally or both, are going to tend to see things in that way. And so it's hard, I think, to know the difference, because you want to address it. You do not want abusiveness to go on, but nor do you want to get sort of down in the muck and become part of the problem. Again, call me, and I'd be happy to talk, this over with you more. I think this is a direction that we, as the coalition, we'd like to do more of this, because I think our programs have so much potential, and so often it's not realized because of these kinds of things. And so if there's something that we can do to make that better and make our organization stronger, we'd like to.
And Debbie had one more question. When a longtime director needs more than the usual quote-unquote 10 days off because of illness, how do we handle that without it being seen as favoritism?
Boy, you guys are asking me all the easy questions. Oh, no, you're not. Time off is critical. It's critical. And directors, staff people and directors need time off. And illness is one of the ways in which the stress of trying to run one of these organizations shows up. And so, again, I don't know what your policies are. Maybe your director gets more vacation or not. I mean, I don't know. But making sure that your policies are fair, but also, trying to ensure that you're taking care of people and asking the question. I mean, if someone needs 10 days off at a time because of illness, then that's something that can be, I would say, discussed, right? What is the level of stress that person is experiencing in the organization, and are there other things that can be done? Because that's a form of flight, right? That's a withdrawal. Like, I can't handle this anymore, so I'm just not going to come to work for 10 days, or I'm going to get sick and not come to work for 10 days. That's a symptom. That's a trauma symptom, right? And so beginning to look at that and dealing with it. I know these are not easy answers. I know it's not a quick fix, like, well, you do these 3 things and then it's, it'll all be good. It's deeper and more complex than that. But I think having a conversation and looking at the level of stress and and trauma that your staff, including your director, may be feeling.